And good morning, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It is called McDuff, Kennedy's Man to Smash the CIA. However, this is our backup channel because our channel got smashed by termination of service from YouTube about 2 months ago. But we are carrying on here gangbusters on McDuff underscore 2020. Even though I sometimes start the show with the old name, it's the same content, it's the same product, and we're glad that you're all joining us this morning. Hello, Rupert from the Netherlands. I see your question or your comment, and we will definitely mention that. And good morning to everyone else. So once again, it's my privilege to welcome to our show Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche Pack website, larouchepack.com, and a journalist, a writer, and a reporter on current events and the history of our crazy times for a number of very successful decades now. Glad to have you with us again, Harley. Thanks again for making time to join us. This is your second visit to McDuff Show in December, and I have to thank you particularly for making time for us on this very important day. So how
Well,
are
let's
you?
call it a Christmas special I'm giving you.
Okay, and Merry Christmas, everybody. And by the way, LaRouchePack.com does take contributions. And if you're thinking of making some Christmas contributions, think of LaRouche Pack.
Well, thank you.
Well, Harley, today is the big day for the electoral votes in the states. And a lot of people are really kind of upset and nervous. I was up early this morning, and the first thing I did was got into an argument on Twitter with somebody. I think it's kind of a touchy, difficult situation for everyone. We don't know what's going to happen. And what does your crystal ball tell you about what direction we're going, and what can we do? What can we do as citizens to try to keep this country together?
Well, I think the first thing is you can't panic. What's been done with the election, the election theft, so to speak, is a continuation of what's been going on for 4 years. And no one should be surprised that every string was pulled and everything was done that could be done to try to remove Donald Trump from the White House. Now, I think the important question that people should reflect on is, number one, why was he such a threat to the establishment that they spent so much energy over 4 years to smear, slander, and lie about him? Secondly, why was there such a uniform response when the question of vote fraud was raised? Given, if you think about it for a moment, there's so many different irregularities. Whether or not you believe there was fraud or not, wouldn't you think that people would want to know what actually happened? Because why did the vote counting stop in the 6 battleground states uniformly at around 10 p.m. on election eve and then pick up a few hours later? How is it that a candidate who never campaigned got so many votes? Now, granted, there was a big anti-Trump vote out there, but most of the polls showed there was not that great enthusiasm for Joe Biden. Also, questions raised by tech experts, cyber experts, people like Bill Binney, as to the anomaly of 130,000 votes showing up after a pause, and not a single one of them for Donald Trump. Now, if I were a supporter of Joe Biden, which I'm not, but if I were a supporter of Joe Biden, I would like to know myself, how did he get 130,000 votes in one drop and not a single one for Trump? Because that does raise suspicions. But the uniform response, no fraud, it's a baseless charge. Not even the Supreme Court didn't take it to investigate. Most every other court threw it out using the line from the media. And maybe some of the legal cases, the legal suits were not drafted so well, included misspellings, other kinds of things. Well, it was a rush. It was an important thing. But elections are sacrosanct for our country. The belief that we have an elected government that responds to the will of the people. You'd think you would want to take every effort to make sure that all the questions are put to rest. But they didn't do it. And you know what that does, John? You know that. It just makes people have more questions. Why won't they allow an investigation? So I did a presentation at a Schiller Institute conference over the weekend, and I laid out three possible avenues for the president to raise this outside of the court system. Because I think the courts right now are pretty much a dead end, although Sidney Powell's still filing suits. There are other suits out there. But first of all, he should finally, once and for all, get someone in there who will release all the documents that have been classified related to Russiagate and to the election. Put it all out in the open. Make it available to the public, not just to a handful of people in the House and the Senate. And we'd learn a lot more than we already know about the efforts that were engaged in by the enemies of Trump to end his administration. Then secondly, since we know those same enemies were involved in vote counting and the way the election was run, why not appoint a special prosecutor to look into the possibility of criminal action? Vote fraud is a felony. And if the president were to assign a special prosecutor, we'd learn a lot, because a special prosecutor would have subpoena power. For example, the people sitting in that Fulton County vote counting room in Atlanta, Georgia, where at least the suspicion is there that they were bringing in votes that had not been there before. That's something that I think should be investigated. And then the third thing that we've recommended is pardon Edward Snowden and also free Julian Assange from the extradition, and let the two of them come to the United States with safe passage to answer questions about what they know about how the surveillance state operates and cyber operations and so on. So I think that those are three avenues for the president. This is sort of a scorched earth policy, but I don't think he's going to get a fair day in court. And all these rumors about servers seized in Frankfurt and these other things, where are they? I think these were rumors meant as a distraction, or that the Chinese printed all the paper ballots and they were delivered by the Chinese. Look, the Chinese have no ability to shut down the vote in 6 states, the vote count in 6 states, and it's another diversion. The real question then is to look at the relationship between the hysteria when Donald Trump won in 2016 and the 4 years of attacks on him. And then is there a possibility that those networks, which include the most important networks from the intelligence community in the United States and Great Britain, as well as many people embedded in the permanent bureaucracy of the Justice Department, Homeland Security, Defense Department, State Department, and elsewhere, is there a possibility that they pulled some scam with the election? Now, if we can have that discussion and have it brought into the open, I think it would avoid what otherwise people seem to want, which is either an imposition of martial law declared by Trump, or if Biden ends up as president, rioting from the Trump side that would lead to an imposition of martial law by Biden. Suspending the Constitution is not a good way to defend the Constitution. So I think we should take all constitutional measures possible to get to the bottom of these questions. So what's in my crystal ball? Turmoil, chaos, and hopefully reason will prevail.
Wow. Yeah, it's pretty much the way I see it too. I've been studying you guys' material as we talk, and especially the great resource of EIR and all the great old articles. And it appears to me that you guys at LaRouche and Schiller Institute combined have a tremendous archive of materials that have never been really explored in mainstream history, mainstream scholarship, mainstream media, anybody. And one of the things that I notice is it's so easy to bust a guy like William Barr if you just do a little bit of research and you see, man, this guy's been a cover-up artist for the CIA since my dad was alive. I mean, this is the deep state. And how do we account for President Trump hanging on to William Barr? Do you have any idea?
Well, no. Speculation may be that he figures that Barr will protect him going forward, if there are cases brought against him, or maybe Barr has blackmail material on him. So far, President Trump has not been susceptible to blackmail. He's done what he said he was going to do and what he wants to do. But, you always have in the back of your mind, knowing something about how the FBI and the CIA work, that there may be something else that's held over as a threat. And you know this from the period around John Kennedy and the Kennedy assassination. There were many people who knew things who, when they tried to come forward, ended up with an early end to their life expectancy. They ended up dead. And there are people who are very much afraid of the fact that you have assassins on the payroll of these institutions, these agencies. So, I think there may be something to do with that. But, one of the things to go back to what you said about the EIR, the Executive Intelligence Review, a national security advisor to Ronald Reagan named Bailey, Norman Bailey, I think was his name, said in 1984, I believe, the EIR is the best private intelligence service in the world. And we had been doing investigations into such things at that time as the Moro assassination, Operation Gladio, what NATO was deploying as irregular warfare forces that could have gone back to the Kennedy assassination. And that's what he was talking about. Now, what we covered in over the years was explosive. The interrelationship between British intelligence through Chatham House and the Royal Institute of International Affairs with the elite establishment in the United States. And they couldn't shut LaRouche up by telling him not to say it or by threatening him, because he basically was as straight and narrow as they come. So what did they do? They put out a story in the Washington Post by one of the editors saying the best way to deal with LaRouche is cancel him, is make him a non-person. So before the whole cancel culture that we see now, in the late 1970s, the Washington Post said, don't ever cover LaRouche unless you want to accuse him of committing crimes. And that's been fairly consistent. Now, when we started winning some elections in the mid-1980s, then they started covering us. And what did they say? We're Nazis, we're communists, we're KGB agents, we're Stasi agents, we're Ku Klux Klan operatives. Every vile slander you could think of. And if you go back over the years and look at what we produced, in spite of all these attacks, we developed very significant contacts in almost every single intelligence agency, media, legitimate media network in the world. People wanted to talk to us. They wanted to know what we know. They wouldn't say it publicly. And they would say all sorts of nasty things about LaRouche. But behind the scenes, people came to us and asked us for our assessment. So I think now, in the era of Donald Trump, when people see some of a reflection of what LaRouche was saying, I mean, Roger Stone said that Lyndon LaRouche was the backstage for the Trump election, because some of the things we were reporting on the deep state and the connection between intelligence warfare and financial policy is part of the thinking of Donald Trump. Not that Trump reads LaRouche, or I wish he would read the Executive Intelligence Review, but that some of his suspicions conform to what we've been reporting for a long time. Now, how do we get this out? We're going to keep doing what we're doing. And fortunately, I've been able to develop a kind of a network of honest reporters like yourself who really do dig for the truth, who are at a point where they basically say, if it gets me in trouble, so be it. I want people to know what's been shaping the policies for the last more than a half century. And I think more people in the United States today than ever are open to looking at these things. So, will the Trump era end with a whimper and nothing coming out, or will there be more disclosures? I sure hope, and I'm going to fight with every breath of my being to make sure that these stories, these truthful stories of who's been rigging the system for the last 50 years, that these stories get out.
Well, bravo, and thank you and for making it all available online. So easy to just go to LaRouche.pub and put in the search engine, which I do. I do it every day now, and it's just fascinating to see all these connections. May I try to put a couple things together in one question, and
Sure.
maybe we can sort this
Yeah.
out.
Okay.
One of the great books that you all participated in or wrote, published, is Dope Inc. And one of the things that I have studied about Bill Barr was his role in the Noriega case, and the little book by Chip Tatum, which explains the whole thing, in which Barr comes down as kind of a enforcer, consigliere, and wants to know, where's the money, Lebowski? He's like
Yeah.
the heavy guy, and so he knows all about Dope Incorporated. He knows all about the illegal and illicit activities of the CIA that's been going on since 1947 and before. He knows all about that stuff. Nobody talks about it. It reminds me of one of the first things I saw maybe 8-9 years ago when I started looking into this stuff, and I ran into Robert Anton Wilson making a presentation in which he said, the CIA and the mafia have gotten in bed together, and they're working together. And one day, one of the other one's going to come out on top. And a lot of people are betting on the CIA because they're these Princeton types and they're smart and they got the technology. But I'm going to bet on the mafia because they know how to get things done. And, I'm paraphrasing, but this is still in effect from Gladio. I've just read on my show 2 months ago the great book by Paul L. Williams, which puts together a lot of the great work that you guys, I'm sure, were relied on by Paul Williams and other authors in telling the story of Gladio and the Vatican Bank and Roberto Calvi and all that stuff. So this stuff is in literature now. It's not secret. Now, the final part of my question is Catherine Austin Fitz, who published yesterday on her Twitter what she calls the red button question. And the red button question is, suppose that you, by pushing this red button, could end all the illegal narcotic sales in the world, that it would all just immediately stop. Would you push the red button knowing that our financial system, at least, remember the British did it once, I think it was either the Libor thing or something, but where they said, hey, if we bust so-and-so for dope dealing, then the whole financial system of the world could come tumbling down.
Yeah.
So all this stuff piles into one big question of Harley, how can we sort out the need of everybody to get this monkey off our back, this monkey that's on our back, which is an addictive substance that has been used to take over country after country after country, from the British Empire to the Dutch to the OSS to whatever's going on right now. And this is the problem. How do we deal with the incredible amount of money in the dope trade? And isn't that likely to be what's going on behind the scenes here, where, hey, the Iran deal fall through, somebody's ox is getting gored, and it's not just about, legitimate trade. So that's a big question. I look forward to hearing.
It's a very big question.
I look forward to hearing your response. Excuse me for being a little bit disorganized with it, but I think you see what I'm saying. We got to deal with this dope problem.
Well, let me take up two threads of that and then come to the bigger picture. You mentioned the question of Bill Barr. People seem to forget that he has a long-term close friendship with Robert Mueller. And this has a lot to do with what is not being disclosed right now. Between Brennan and the current CIA director Haspel sitting on documents that would show the GCHQ MI6 role in Russiagate, between Barr giving Mueller a kind of way out, because what really should have happened after Mueller's report was put out And it should have been shot full of holes, not just a question of, well, this exonerates Trump. No, it actually shows that the whole operation was a criminal conspiracy to destroy a presidency. And the way Barr handled it, everyone said, oh, Barr covered up for Trump. He covered up for Mueller. The Mueller question never came out. And it was at that point that I got a little suspicious about whether this whole Durham thing would pan out. And it looks like, Barr is telling Durham to use the old Dean Smith four corners approach and just dribble out the clock. So, Barr is certainly important in this. But the other connection, then you go from Mueller to his relationship with Comey. You take a look at their role covering up Hongshang Bank. Because when you talk about Dope Incorporated, you talk about the British, you talk about money laundering, you get to Hongshang. How many times has Hongshang had a verdict against them? How many times have they had a verdict against them on money laundering where they've been fined a couple $1 billion? They pay the fine. That's the interest on the money laundering for 24 hours. That's not a big fine for them. Why has that bank not been shut down? Now, if you understand Hongshang, it goes back to the Second Opium War that the British waged against the Chinese. And that's where Dope Inc., the book, starts. That this is not something new. The British used Hong Kong as the transshipment point for drugs going into China. And when the Chinese tried to fight it in 1839 and then again in 1859, the British sent the Royal Navy to cram the drugs down the throats of the Chinese. They seized Hong Kong and they used it as a center for bringing the drugs in and bringing the money and laundering it and bringing it out. That's what Hong Kong Shanghai has been. And the fact that I think it was Comey was on the board for a period of time, they never found it. Every time it got brought up, they gave a slap on the wrist to it. It's still functioning. Now, when you talk then about why they have to keep that, it was Eric Holder who, after the 2008 blow-up, the derivatives market tied to the mortgage-backed securities blew out, and they were trying to decide what to do with it. And people were saying, prosecute the bankers. And Holder said, you can't do it because these are too big to fail. If they fail, the system goes. Well, the system is a fraudulent system. It's based on secrecy, the role of the British on this with the tax havens, the offshore islands, the Caribbean banks. All of this is known. Who controls world derivative traffic? The derivatives are close to $1 quadrillion in nominal value that are traded every day. The counterparties are run by the British. The trading is run by the British. When Brexit happened, the City of London got an exemption from the European Union to be able to continue handling the derivatives trading of European countries and banks. Now, derivatives are somewhat of a next generation of the drug trafficking. Now, the drug trafficking provides liquidity. There's no question that this is a big part of international corruption, arms trafficking, funding of terrorism, and so on. Going back to, as you know, Vietnam, what was it, Air America, and then Southern Air Transport during the period you mentioned with Noriega and others. The drug trafficking was a central feature. Actually, it goes back further. It goes back to Lucky Luciano, doesn't it? And the invasion of Sicily in World War II. There's the mob and what became the CIA in bed together. But this was something that was a marriage of convenience for a long time. And it's something which then continued inside the financial system. Now, do you think bankers like Jamie Dimon and the people at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, they don't know this? Of course they know it. But you're right in the sense that if this were shut down, you'd have a grind to a halt of some of the operations. Now, what they've been doing to supplement this is going into the permanent quantitative easing, the QE to infinity. As long as the monetary players, the central bankers, are asked by the private banks, the big private banks, we need liquidity, we need liquidity. They pump it out, they give it to them. And this is, at least with drug money, there was actually cash. Just like, as I often point out, with Milken's operation with leverage buyouts and those kinds of things, they had to come up with cash. With the derivatives, you don't even need cash. You make trade in financial instruments that they know have no way of determining what the actual value is, but they buy and sell them and make their profit margins on the trading. Now, that requires a huge volume of liquidity to keep these things solvent, these markets solvent. So the question is not so much liquidity anymore, it's solvency. The system as a whole is insolvent, but it's flush with liquidity thanks to the central banks. Now, they know at some point this is going to trigger a hyperinflation. That's why they're now talking about moving to a global digitalized currency so that they can handle it through the mechanisms, the various algorithms of the central banks, and protect the banks, which are the most insolvent, and grab whatever liquidity they can from families and small businesses that until now were considered solvent. So they're going to take liquidity out of the part of the economy which is solvent based on buying and selling of real goods, producing real goods. They're going to shut that down, steal that money, and go with a total flow of liquidity to keep the banks going. And then when the hyperinflation hits, the banks can sell off their debt at a nominal cost, get out of debt, and then be the ones who control the financial system completely. Because the regime change they're talking about is not only controlling monetary and credit policy, but fiscal policy. In other words, no governments can get in the way. Now, that's where we've gone in the last 50 years from the money laundering of the drug banks that we covered in Dope Incorporated to today the control by the City of London and Wall Street as a junior partner in the global derivatives trade and the new financial instruments. And in order for this to work, they cannot allow any sovereign governments to get in the way. Because a sovereign government that's worth anything is one which is going to say, well, we've got people who are hungry. We have transportation that's crashed. We have energy grids that are unreliable. We have a military which, like the British Navy, has leaks in their ships when they try to go into the South China Sea. So any sovereign government worth its salt would recognize you have to do something to shut down this funny money, this fiat currency operation. So that's why they overthrow sovereign governments. And right now you have three governments that represent the greatest threat to this international thievery. It's Russia, and Russia because it's a strong military, not because of its economy. But Russia has very little debt and a lot of gold. So if you have a reset based on physical economy, Russia's in good shape. China, which has resisted the demand that they open their banking system to this international monetary financial scam. And China is a growing economy, and we see it's one of the few economies in the world that's growing after the COVID crisis hit. And the United States, which is sovereign because of our Constitution. So here's the irony. You have some of the people defending Donald Trump who say the problem is China. China's responsible for COVID. China's responsible for vote fraud. China's responsible for spying on us. Well, the people who are putting that line out are the same ones who ran Russiagate for the last 4 years. There's an attack on Trump, Xi Jinping, and Putin because these represent the three figures who explicitly support the idea of sovereign nation states working together to collaborate on the common aims of mankind. So, how do you address this? This is why they didn't want Trump meeting with Putin. They pulled out all the stops. Remember, anytime he was supposed to meet with him on the sidelines of a G7 or a G20 event, we had a new discovery of chemical weapons use in Syria or poisoning of a former Russian agent. Or the Navalny affair. So they used all of these things, thanks to the help of the British and Porton Downs, the British chemical weapons place, the White Helmets, which is a British fraudulent NGO that was staging these so-called chemical weapons attacks in Syria. They used these to keep Trump from meeting with Putin. And I think this is an important point that people have to grasp. Economic policy requires sovereign nations that function on behalf of the productive sectors of their economy and of making sure that there's an education system that turns out scientists, engineers, and skilled workers who can bring online new technologies. If you destroy those sovereign governments and make them dependent on money laundering, liquidity pumping, and intelligence warfare to survive, you can control the world. And that's what we're dealing with, an out-of-control financial oligarchy that did everything they could to destroy the Trump administration and is still pushing for regime change in China and Russia. And if they're not stopped, we'll end up in a nuclear war. Did I answer the
well?
for you?
Well, right. You took my breath away when you said nuclear war at the end, because that's the scary. That's one of the scary things, or even just any type of war at this point. They've got such terrible weapons, and maybe they can do it all with lasers at this point, or directed energy weapons from space. The next war is not going to be pretty, and it's not going to be long. I think it'll be over fast, and we'll be gone. Yeah. Now, no, we still haven't sorted out what to do with all this dope traffic that's going on. But maybe if I turn to the Belt and Road, which is my other subject I wanted to ask you about today, because a lot of what we've been investigating, and people at the Neighborhood News Studio who are with us this morning, by the way, hi guys, the cabals centered around companies like DynCorp and this Otpor thing in Serbia, and all of these financial military intelligence combined things that seem to be involved in creating nuclear power, whether big nuclear power plants is proposed in like Saudi Arabia, or these little smaller nuclear power things that can be used for fracking and other things. But how does all of that fit in with the Belt and Road idea, which I know is very, very much a Schiller Institute idea? I bought the book yesterday or 2 days ago. What's it called? The Silk Road 2, or the new Silk Road?
Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, I think.
Right. So, I mean, it sounds beautiful, but at the same time, do we have a lot of people that are behind the scenes trying to get their piece of it, trying to get their hands on the title to, the uranium in the Kazakhstan uranium bank, for instance? And all of this seems to be part of the election problem, in that people that are on the Democrat side, like Podesta, and then look at the Peter Strzok and all of these, these real what I would call slimy characters that have been doing horrible things behind the scenes just to conquer resource areas, to get people cleared off of land. All this stuff has got to be addressed too. And that's my problem with the election, is if Biden is allowed to have the White House, these people are in. I mean, they've got a 4-year get out of jail free card, and the hope of stopping all this illegal activity is gone. So is the Belt and Road going to be a great commerce area that we can be proud of in 100 years, or is it another boondoggle that people are going to be just using to grab up money by stealing resources and creating wars?
Well, it's going to be a fight, and let me give you a little background, because this is something that we were very much involved in going back to the fall of the Soviet Union, which was forecast by Lyndon LaRouche after the Russians rejected Ronald Reagan's offer of sharing the Strategic Defense Initiative. And when the Soviet Union fell, there was a proposal that Mrs. LaRouche had made, because Lyndon LaRouche was in prison by that time, jailed by Bush and Mueller and others. So Mrs. LaRouche took a proposal that you have the Germans, instead of reunification being Germany underwriting the European Union, which would take away sovereignty of every European state, she proposed, why don't the Germans, the French, the Austrians, and a few others work to modernize industry in Eastern Europe as a move into Eurasia, with the full completion of the idea of the Trans-Siberian Railroad that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. That is a Eurasian economic space in which you would have high-speed rails connecting as a connecting point of new cities, the development of new industries. And one of the people who liked this idea was Alfred Herrhausen, who was the then president of Deutsche Bank. And he prepared a paper for a conference talking about this, not necessarily using LaRouche's idea by name, but that was the idea he was talking about. He was assassinated by the so-called third generation of Baader-Meinhof terrorists, which was probably a cell operating by British intelligence. And another person working with him, Rohweder, who was in charge of the sell-off of the Eastern Germany industry, he was proposing you use that as the basis of building up the economy in Eastern Germany. He was killed also. And so the idea was pushed off. Now, Mrs. LaRouche continued. She went to China a few times and spoke about this potential. But in 2013, the decision was made by Xi Jinping to incorporate all these different development approaches into a Belt and Road Initiative. The idea being that you would have interconnection, corridors of development, which would be centered around high-speed rail, but also development of new cities, industrial science cities, what's called a newplex, where you have nuclear power in the city center that allows for the development of a whole area, science and industry and cultural connections. The whole idea, that was Mrs. LaRouche's idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it pretty much became the proposal from Xi Jinping. Now, for the most part, for the first 3 or 4 years, we heard nothing about this in the West, but it was underway. They were building it. You know, China has, I think, close to 25,000 kilometers of high-speed rail right now. They're moving to set up magnetically levitated trains that can go up to 600 kilometers per hour, 400 miles an hour, connecting cities. And they're working on this with Japan and other countries, developing new ports for expanding trade, what they call the Maritime Silk Road. So all of this was underway, and you heard almost nothing about it. Then all of a sudden, it became the greatest threat to the West. And this was under the last period of Obama, when he put forward the pivot to Asia, which was an attempt to isolate and contain China. Suddenly, they realized there was something being done in China using what had been essentially set up by the World Trade Organization to use China as cheap labor for Western corporations. Well, the Chinese didn't just provide cheap labor. They wanted to expand and develop their labor force. And so they had huge science programs, technology, engineering programs, and they built up a cadre force that was highly qualified to move into the next generation of things ranging from artificial intelligence to space technology and so on. They made huge jumps, and they started surpassing the West in some of these. Now, it was at that point they became a threat. But here's the real point. The British always approach these things from two standpoints. They have two policies. It was Palmerston who said, we have no permanent friends, only permanent interests. And so on the one side, the British were totally gung-ho with Pompeo's containment policy. We'll send our fleet of ships to back you up in the South China Sea. Only the one major aircraft carrier they had sprang a leak, and it's going to be in dry dock for the next year because the British economy is a shambles. But their idea is we'll fight China to the last American. That's the British view. So they're gung-ho for expanding NATO eastward, what they're calling in England the East of Suez policy, a reference back to 1956. maintain the empire and in the Indo-Pacific region and so on. So at the same time, they're talking with a bellicose language. They're opening up the city of London as the yuan center, the yuan exchange center for Europe, trying to get their own contracts on the Belt and Road Initiative because British industry is a shambles. They're looking for any kind of upgrade they can get. So they're on both sides of this. Now, what makes people suspicious is they say, well, didn't the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and these bad guys build up China with the free trade agreement? Well, they did, but they did it for a specific purpose, to make money, to get cheap labor, and to use China to make sure there's no strikes, there's no quality control, there's no air pollution standards or water pollution standards. In other words, cheapen the cost of every aspect of production and bring those goods to Walmart, where people who used to produce those goods now have to go to buy them. Now, the Chinese weren't into that. The Chinese were happy to have these industries, but they learned, and sometimes they say it's industrial espionage. Well, if you put companies inside another country, that other country, no matter where it is going to study those technologies. And if they're at all smart, they'll develop the capabilities themselves, including leapfrogging to the next arena. So did the Rockefellers and Rothschilds and the British bankers set up China to become the new empire? No, because the Chinese have a different goal than the British. The British goal is to keep the rest of the world subservient to British finance, to protect that with U.S. military power, but not to eliminate poverty in China. But the Chinese government made it their responsibility to eliminate poverty in China. Now, I'm not saying everything the Chinese do is good and great, but the Belt and Road Initiative has been brought into Africa to do something that the European colonialists never did. Build railroads to connect the great cities of Africa, to connect the inland areas with population centers with the ports. This is something they're doing in Kenya and Ethiopia. They're building infrastructure that's useful for the people, not just for the mining companies. Now, we're told this is a debt trap. This is so rich in irony. The debt trap, as we know from the economic hitmen of Perkins, the debt trap is the International Monetary Fund and the European colonialists. What the Chinese are doing is providing physical goods production run by Africans for Africans. Now, if China makes a little profit on it, fine, they're happy for that, but they're also increasing the potential market for Chinese goods. So it's one of these dual questions, John. Is China acting for its own self-interest, or is it acting on behalf of a cabal of bankers who are using them to destroy the American century? Now, this is where you have to read very carefully what Xi Jinping has said in many of his internal speeches. He wants to work with the United States. He doesn't want an economic decoupling because that would be a disaster for China. And I don't think President Trump was committed to an economic decoupling. I think he opportunistically seized on this whole question of China and coronavirus to cover up for some missteps that we had, and for the fact that the cupboard was bare, that under Obama and Obamacare, our public health system was destroyed. But I think if Trump had a second term, we would see phase 2 of the trade agreement with China. We would see a number of other things come into being. And hopefully Pompeo would be given a pink slip so that he would be thrown out, along with Bolton and Esper and his other buddies. So, you know, the China question, the Belt and Road Initiative, and if you read through the report that you got, you'll see it's full of studies from other countries that are talking about how they can upgrade their productive capabilities. And this was always the goal of Lyndon LaRouche, was to develop these regional economic development packages, which were not allowed by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or the global bankers, but which are necessary if you're going to overcome the endemic poverty in Africa, in parts of Asia, in parts of South America. And the Chinese are going into these areas and offering technology and credit where those countries cannot get it from the West. So I think this is going to be the big issue of the next 25 to 50 years, the next generation. Will America participate in this as a partner with China? Or will we fall into this Thucydides trap and assume that one country that's rising up, when another country is collapsing, they'll go to war? Now, the key to understanding the Thucydides trap, it's when you're dealing with empires. The United States is not an empire. We've been functioning as an adjunct to the British Empire. But if we went back to the American system, the imperial forces here and the banks and others would be put under regulations that would take their power away. And so my final point, and I know I'm maybe a little too long-winded on this, but the final point would be, how do you deal with this? Rigorous law enforcement when it comes to drug trafficking and drug money laundering. But secondly, regulation of the banks. Go back to Glass-Steagall. Protect commercial banks so that their depositors and their savers are protected from the speculative swindlers who have turned these so-called universal banks into seed capital for their speculation. Under Glass-Steagall, you would say to the Morgan Stanleys and the hedge funds and others, you want to speculate to your heart's content. But if you lose, you eat the losses, and there'll be no bailouts and no bail-ins either, because the Dodd-Frank bill gave them the right to steal their depositors' cash the way it was done in Cyprus some years ago. So no bailouts, no bail-ins, you eat your losses. Meanwhile, we're going to protect the commercial banking system because we need it as a credit generation agency to rebuild the physical economy. That would take the power away from these central bankers. And I think that's why LaRouche viewed this question of monetary sovereignty, economic sovereignty, as the key to undermining this globalist theft of resources and destruction of nations.
I'm going to venture one more question. May I?
Sure.
How now do we take this new pronouncement by Pope Francis and the folks at the World Economic Forum, that they are now going to work together to create a, kinder, gentler capitalism? Of course, they have our best interest in mind. Nod, nod, wink, wink. So how do they fit into the Belt and Road, and how do they fit into who's going to win the election?
Well, the World Economic Forum invited Xi Jinping 2 years ago to give a presentation, and he said what he was going to do. And what started to happen after that is people started going to Beijing to figure out how they could buy into it. And they found out that the Chinese are not so open to the idea of having Western banking methods inside China. So what happens? All of a sudden, regime change in Hong Kong. Now, who funded the regime change movement that came out in Hong Kong? I mean, remember, Hong Kong was a British colony until, 1999, I guess. George Soros. People claim they don't like Soros, but when Soros goes in and tries to overthrow a government they don't like, all of a sudden he's okay. So you have Steve Bannon, who has personal financial interests in shorting the yuan and destroying China. These are some of the people who were involved in promoting the so-called Hong Kong freedom movement. Now, to get to the question you just asked, where's this going to go? First of all, the Pope is hard to take seriously if you know that he's a Jesuit and the role of the Jesuits in history. As far as I can see, he's on the side of the globalists. And his discussion of capitalism with a human face, where we saw this before? In the 1970s, there was a group called ICNEP, the Initiative Committee for New Economic Planning, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which actually spoke of the idea of capitalism with a human face. So this is not a new idea. Remember George Herbert Walker Bush, the kinder, gentler America? Mm-hmm. They'll do anything to come up with a PR gimmick for covering the looting and killing that they do. As far as I'm concerned with the Pope being involved in this, he's been taken over by these phony environmental groups that are actually trying to shut down development in the third world, that will make the situation worse for poorer countries in the name of helping everybody. And some people say, well, they're pushing global socialism. Well, it's not really socialism, it's feudalism. And
That's right.
this Pope is a feudalist in terms of his outlook. And that's why he's working with people like Schwab of the World Economic Forum, because the World Economic Forum is financed by the worst of the global corporate cartels, whether it's Monsanto and the grain cartels or the bankers or insurance cartels. That's what we're dealing with, a world of either sovereign nation states or empires that are supranational, that are not like the Habsburgs of old, except they really are. They're just more sophisticated. That's what the fight is. And I'm sure that's what your father was involved in when he took a look at this, when this was starting to take place after World War II, when Franklin Roosevelt's idea of world cooperation for the common aims of mankind was perverted into the United States protecting colonial empires, whether it was Vietnam, whether it was in Africa. John Kennedy rebelled against that. He was with FDR, and he was killed. And that fight continues and will continue until we take power away from these globalists.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. That puts it very clear in my mind as to who I'm for and who I'm not for. And, you know, my hope and my belief right now is I actually agree with Secretary Pompeo, who said there will be a peaceful transition to the next Trump administration. So hopefully I can leave it there, Harley, and we'll all smile and say, you know, MAGA, you know, make America great again, because we need another Trump 4 years, 4 more years, President Trump.
We do, and we need it without Mike Pompeo.
That's right. Okay.
Trump is finding some good people now, and you know that's a hopeful sign. Whereas if you look at Biden's appointees, they're all the same criminal cabal.
They're lining it up in a hopeful way. I've been really broadcasting a lot on NSAM 57 and the resonance that we have now with the Assistant Secretary of Defense being put in charge of the special ops. That is huge if President Trump gets reelected. If not, then it's just going to go the way of everything else.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks very much, Harley. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah to everyone, and Happy Holidays to everybody for whatever purpose whatsoever. Yes, sir.
And John, I was just going to say, people can write to me as always at harleysch@gmail.com, and I'm in communication with a lot of your viewers now, and I enjoy it. So harleysch@gmail.com.
I'm sure you'll be hearing some more. Thanks again. Everybody
Okay.
Have a great afternoon.